I'm Bonnie, 28 years old, and I'm staring at a $3,500 restaurant bill that's been placed discreetly beside my plate at Le Bernardin. My mother's already photographing the dessert for Instagram, while my father discusses his new boat purchase with the couple at the next table. They haven't spoken to me in 6 months until yesterday when they suddenly invited me to this family reunion dinner. The waiter hovers expectantly near our table. My credit card has a $1,000 limit. My hands shake as I realize this entire dinner was an elaborate trap. Before we dive into this shocking story of family betrayal and financial manipulation, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Are you someone who's dealt with difficult family situations too? Please hit that like button and subscribe if you want to hear more real-life stories about overcoming toxic family dynamics. Trust me, what happens next will leave you speechless, and I promise you'll learn valuable lessons about setting boundaries and recognizing manipulation tactics that could save you from your own family ambush. The phone call came yesterday afternoon while I was at work trying to meet a deadline for a marketing campaign. My mother's name flashed on the screen, and my stomach immediately tightened. Grace Thompson hadn't called me in 6 months, not since I refused to co-sign their home equity loan for what they claimed was urgent home repairs, but was actually for a luxury vacation to Europe. My finger hovered over the decline button, but something made me answer. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was that familiar guilt that had been programmed into me since childhood. Her voice was honey-sweet, dripping with false warmth that I'd learned to recognize over the years. She talked about missing me, about how the family wasn't complete without me, about how my father had been talking about his little girl. My father Frank got on the phone too, his booming voice talking about making amends and starting fresh. They wanted to take me to dinner somewhere special to show me how much they valued our relationship. The red flags were everywhere, waving frantically in my mind, like a storm warning, but loneliness is a powerful drug, and I'd been swimming in it since cutting contact. My therapist, Dr. Martinez, had warned me about this exact scenario during our last session. She'd leaned forward in her chair, her eyes serious behind her glasses, and told me that people like my parents often use grand gestures and expensive settings to manipulate their targets. They create situations where refusing them makes you look like the bad guy, especially in public. But knowing something intellectually and resisting it emotionally are two different battles, and I was losing this one. The memories flooded back as I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear. When I was 16, I'd worked every weekend at a local bakery saving money for college. I'd accumulated nearly $8,000 over 2 years' money that represented early mornings burns from hot ovens and dreams of a better future. One day I went to check my balance and found $12.37. My parents had cleaned out my account for a luxury cruise, claiming they deserved a vacation after raising me. They promised to pay it back, but never did. At 21, I discovered they'd been using my social security number to open credit cards. My credit score was destroyed before I even had a chance to build it. They cried when I confronted them, claiming they'd had no choice, that the bills were overwhelming them. I spent 3 years cleaning up that mess, filing fraud reports, and rebuilding from scratch. The betrayal cut deep, but not as deep as their reaction when I finally stood up to them. They called me selfish, ungrateful, a terrible daughter who didn't understand family loyalty. At 25, I'd finally gotten a decent job and was starting to feel stable when I received a notice from the IRS. My parents had claimed me as a dependent on their taxes for years after I'd moved out, collecting refunds they weren't entitled to. The resulting audit and penalties nearly broke me financially and definitely broke something inside me emotionally. That was when I started seeing Dr. Martinez, when I finally began to understand that this wasn't normal, that parents weren't supposed to treat their children like ATM machines or backup plans. But here I was agreeing to dinner because my mother's voice cracked. When she said she missed me because my father mentioned he'd been having health issues, because despite everything, there was still a part of me that wanted to believe they could change. I insisted on choosing the restaurant, thinking if I picked somewhere expensive enough, they'd have to pay. Le Bernardin was my choice, one of New York's finest French restaurants where appetizers started at $50. Surely they wouldn't dare pull anything in such an upscale establishment. Now sitting in this elegant dining room with its soft lighting and crisp white tablecloths, I realized my mistake. They'd arrived 15 minutes late, breezing in wearing designer clothes that must have cost thousands. My mother's new Louis Vuitton bag sat prominently on the table, and my father kept adjusting his Rolex, making sure everyone could see it. Meanwhile, I sat there in my only nice dress from Target, the one I wore to every important event because it was all I could afford on my $42,000 salary. Without consulting me, they'd ordered champagne to celebrate our reunion. Dom Perignon, the waiter, had announced proudly, as if the name itself justified the $400 price tag. Then came the appetizers, lobster, and oysters, things I'd never order for myself because rent was due next week. My father commanded the wine list like he was born to it, selecting bottles I couldn't pronounce, each one more expensive than my weekly grocery budget. They ordered Wagyu beef, explaining to the waiter that only the best would do for their precious daughter, their voices loud enough for nearby tables to hear. My mother photographed every course, uploading to Instagram with hashtags like Blessed Family and Generous Children and Family First. She posed with the food with my father and insisted on taking selfies with me that I knew would be captioned with lies about our wonderful relationship. Between courses, my father regaled nearby diners with stories about his golf club membership, his new boat, their recent trip to Vegas. He spoke with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never worried about money, who'd never checked their bank balance before buying groceries. I sat there, my anxiety rising with each course, each bottle of wine, each casual mention of their expensive purchases. My 3 roommates were probably eating instant ramen right now while I sat in this temple to excess watching my parents perform their wealth for strangers. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. These were the same people who'd called me last year, claiming they couldn't afford their mortgage payment, who'd guilt-tripped me into sending them $2,000 I couldn't spare money I'd never see again. The waiter refilled our water glasses with practiced precision, and I caught him glancing at me with something that might have been sympathy. Did I look as out of place as I felt? Could he see the panic building behind my forced smile? My parents didn't notice my discomfort or chose to ignore it. They were too busy playing the role of successful people, of parents who had their lives together, of a family that wasn't built on a foundation of financial abuse and emotional manipulation. As the main courses arrived beautifully plated works of art that probably cost more than my monthly subway pass, I tried to calculate the bill in my head. We were already well over $2,000 and they'd just ordered another bottle of wine. My credit card had a $1,000 limit that I kept for emergencies. My checking account had enough for rent and utilities, nothing more. The realization that I was trapped began to sink in a cold dread that settled in my stomach and made the exquisite food taste like ash. The moment of truth arrived with dessert, a symphony of chocolate and gold leaf that my mother insisted on photographing from 12 different angles. The waiter discreetly placed the leather folder beside my plate, not my father's, not in the center of the table, but directly in front of me. The numbers swam before my eyes. $3,500 and change. More than 2 months of my rent, more than I spent on food in 4 months, more than I had in my savings account. I looked up at my parents, hoping this was some mistake, that they would reach for the bill with laughs about the mix-up. Instead, my mother was showing her dessert photo to a woman at the next table, explaining her Instagram aesthetic, while my father checked his phone with the satisfied air of someone who didn't have a care in the world. The silence stretched between us, heavy and expectant, until I finally found my voice. The words came out quietly, barely above a whisper. I asked about the bill, gesturing toward the leather folder that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. My mother turned back to our table, her perfectly made-up face arranging itself into an expression of confused innocence that I'd seen too many times before. She tilted her head, her diamond earrings catching the light, and spoke in a voice dripping with false sweetness. She explained that obviously the person who extends the invitation pays for dinner. It was basic etiquette. She said something everyone knew. My father lowered his phone, his expression shifting to one of mild disappointment, as if I'd committed some social faux pas by even questioning the arrangement. He reminded me that I had that fancy marketing job, now saying it loud enough for other diners to hear, implying I was swimming in money. The truth sat heavy in my chest, $42,000 a year before taxes, 3 roommates in a cramped apartment in Queens, student loans that would take another decade to pay off a 10-year-old car that needed repairs I couldn't afford. I tried to explain my financial situation, keeping my voice low, aware of the elegant diners around us. But my parents had years of practice in public manipulation, and they wielded it like a weapon. My mother's voice rose just enough to attract attention as she launched into a litany of their supposed poverty. They were struggling, she claimed, barely making ends meet. The Louis Vuitton bag on the table seemed to mock her words, but she continued without shame. My father joined in talking about their fixed income, their mounting bills, conveniently forgetting to mention the boat he'd been bragging about an hour earlier. The waiter returned, hovering discreetly, clearly sensing the tension at our table. Other diners were starting to notice, too, their conversations faltering as they picked up on the drama unfolding. My mother, always aware of her audience, began to dab at her eyes with her napkin, careful not to smudge her makeup. She spoke about sacrifice, about all the things they'd given up for me, about how they'd thought raising a child meant that child would care for them in return. My father's tactics were different, but equally effective. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through photos from my childhood, providing commentary loud enough for neighboring tables to hear. Look at this birthday party they threw me when I turned 10. Look at the Christmas presents. Look at the family vacations. Every photo was carefully curated to show their generosity, their devotion. What he didn't mention was that the birthday party was paid for by my grandmother, that the Christmas presents came with emotional price tags. I was still paying that the family vacations were opportunities for them to max out credit cards in my name. I felt my phone buzz in my purse and pulled it out to find a notification from my credit card company. Transaction declined. Insufficient credit available. My hands shook as I realized my parents had orchestrated this perfectly. They knew exactly what they were doing when they chose this restaurant, when they ordered the most expensive items on the menu, when they had the bill placed in front of me. This wasn't a reunion. It was an ambush. My mother noticed my distress and pounced on it like a predator sensing weakness. Her voice took on a wounded quality as she spoke about ungrateful children, about how other families supported each other, about how she'd seen on Facebook that her friend's daughter had bought her parents a new car. She wondered aloud, loud enough for everyone to hear, what she'd done wrong to raise such a selfish child. The couple at the next table exchanged glances, and I could see the judgment forming in their eyes. The manager approached our table, his professional smile not quite hiding his concern. He asked if everything was satisfactory, his eyes moving between us, clearly assessing the situation. My father straightened in his chair, putting on his businessman persona, assuring the manager that everything was wonderful, that we were just having a family discussion. The dismissal was clear, but the manager lingered, his instincts obviously telling him something was wrong. My phone buzzed again, this time with text messages. My cousins, aunts, uncles, all asking variations of the same question. Why was I being so cruel to my parents? Why was I humiliating them in public? How could I invite them to dinner and refuse to pay? My mother's social media machine was already in motion, her flying monkeys deployed before I even had a chance to defend myself. The narrative was being written in real time, and I was being cast as the villain. I tried once more to explain that I couldn't afford the bill, that I hadn't ordered any of this, that I'd been ambushed. But my voice was drowned out by my mother's increasingly dramatic performance. She clutched her chest, talking about heart palpitations, about the stress of having an ungrateful child. My father stood up, his voice booming as he addressed the restaurant at large, talking about entitled millennials who didn't understand the value of family or hard work. The other diners were fully engaged now, some recording on their phones, others whispering among themselves. I heard fragments of their conversations, poor parents, kids these days, how embarrassing for them. The court of public opinion had been swayed, and I was found guilty without trial. My parents had weaponized the restaurant's elegance, the social pressure of the setting the audience of wealthy diners who couldn't fathom parents behaving this way. Just when I thought the situation couldn't get worse, my parents revealed their true agenda. My father pulled out a manila folder from my mother's oversized purse, placing it on the table with the solemnity of someone presenting evidence in court. Inside were glossy brochures featuring smiling faces and promises of financial freedom through essential oils. My heart sank as I recognized the telltale signs of a multi-level marketing scheme, complete with income disclosure statements in tiny print and testimonials that read like fiction. My mother leaned forward, her tears miraculously dried, replaced by the fervent enthusiasm of a true believer. She explained that they'd found an incredible investment opportunity, a ground floor chance to build real wealth. All they needed was $50,000 to buy into the platinum level, and they'd already told their upline that their successful daughter would be investing. She pushed the contracts toward me, multiple copies already filled out with my name waiting only for my signature. The transformation was stunning. Gone were the struggling parents who couldn't afford dinner. In their place sat eager salespeople, their eyes bright with the fever of pyramid scheme dreams. My father launched into a presentation he'd clearly memorized, complete with hand gestures and pause for effect. He talked about passive income, about being their own bosses, about the legacy we could build together as a family. The irony of them trying to sell me on financial freedom while attempting to trap me in debt wasn't lost on me. But the manipulation went deeper than just money. My father pulled out his phone again, but this time the photos were different. Using some app, they'd edited family pictures to remove me entirely. Here was last Christmas at my aunt's house, but I'd been erased, leaving an awkward gap at the dinner table. Here was my cousin's wedding, my image carefully removed from the group photos. My father swiped through dozens of pictures, each one showing a version of our family where I didn't exist. "This is what our family looks like without ungrateful children," he said loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. My mother took over the performance, her voice carrying across the dining room as she explained to our captive audience how I'd abandoned them, how I'd cut them off when they needed me most. She wove a tale of parental devotion, met with filial cruelty of sacrifice, repaid with selfishness. The other diners absorbed every word, some shaking their heads in sympathy, others recording the drama for their own social media. I sat frozen, watching my character being assassinated, in real time unable to form words against the onslaught. Then, as if following a script, Harold and Janet appeared at our table. My mother expressed surprise that was clearly feigned, exclaiming about the coincidence of running into them here. But I recognized them from the MLM brochures, their faces prominently featured as platinum-level success stories. They air-kissed my parents and turned their attention to me, their smiles sharp as knives. Harold immediately launched into his own success story, how the essential oils had changed his life, how he had retired at 52, how his children were set for life. Janet chimed in with testimonials about the products themselves, pulling small bottles from her purse, like a magician revealing tricks. She dabbed oil on her wrists, insisting I smell the blend that had cured her arthritis, her insomnia, her chronic fatigue. The performance was polished, practiced, and perfectly timed. Other diners were leaning in, some seemed interested in the oils themselves. My parents had turned Le Bernardin into their personal sales floor, and I was both the mark and the entertainment. The pressure intensified as Harold revealed that my parents had already announced my investment to the entire upline. There was a special ceremony next week where new platinum members would be recognized. My name was in the program. People were excited to meet the successful daughter who was joining the family business. The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope. They'd created a situation where backing out wouldn't just disappoint my parents, but an entire network of strangers who'd been sold a lie about my participation. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing. The family group chat was exploding with messages. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years were asking why I was being cruel to Aunt Grace and Uncle Frank. My grandmother, who I thought understood the situation, sent a message asking if I'd really invited them to dinner just to humiliate them. The narrative my parents had crafted was spreading like wildfire through our extended family, each retelling, adding new embellishments, new evidence of my cruelty. My mother, seeing me check my phone, smiled with satisfaction. She loudly mentioned that she'd been keeping the family updated on my behavior, that everyone deserved to know what kind of person I really was. She pulled out her own phone, showing me her Facebook page where she'd been live streaming parts of our dinner. The comments were brutal strangers, calling me entitled, selfish, a disgrace to my family. She'd tagged our location, and I realized with horror that some of these commenters were actually in the restaurant watching our drama unfold in person. Janet leaned in closer, her perfume mixing with the essential oils to create a cloying cloud. She whispered that this didn't have to be difficult. Just sign the papers, make the investment, and everything would go back to normal. My parents would forgive me. The family would welcome me back. The narrative would shift from ungrateful daughter to smart investor. All I had to do was give them $50,000 I didn't have for a business opportunity that was clearly a scam. When I shook my head, unable to find words to respond to the insanity, my father's mask finally slipped completely. He grabbed my wrist, not hard enough to leave marks, but firm enough to make his point. He informed me that he knew where I worked, knew my boss's name, knew the coffee shop where I stopped every morning. The threat was clear: comply or face harassment at every turn. My mother added that they'd already driven by my apartment, such a nice neighborhood, such friendly roommates who'd answered the door when they knocked last week. The casual mention of stalking, delivered with smiles for the benefit of our audience, sent ice through my veins. They'd researched my life, mapped my routines, identified pressure points they could exploit. This wasn't desperation driving them. It was calculated cruelty. The essential oil scheme was just the latest in a lifetime of manipulations, but the stakes kept rising, their tactics growing more extreme with each attempt. The manager reappeared this time, with security subtly positioned nearby. He asked again if everything was all right, his eyes lingering on my father's grip on my wrist. My father released me immediately, laughing too loudly, assuring everyone we were just having a spirited family discussion about an exciting business opportunity. Harold and Janet backed him up, turning their sales pitch toward the manager, offering him samples of their miracle oils. The scene was spiraling into surreal territory, but the threat beneath the performance was very real. I tried to stand up to leave this nightmare, dressed as a family dinner, but my parents moved in perfect synchronization to block my exit. My father shifted his chair to trap me against the wall, while my mother grabbed my wrist where my father had held it moments before. Her manicured nails dug into my skin, leaving crescent-shaped marks that would bruise by tomorrow. The mask of loving parents had completely fallen away, replaced by something predatory and desperate that made my blood run cold. My father rose to his full height, his voice booming across the restaurant as he launched into a tirade about ungrateful millennials who didn't understand sacrifice or family values. His performance was calculated for maximum impact, hitting all the talking points that would resonate with the older, wealthy clientele around us. He spoke about participation trophies and safe spaces, about entitlement and laziness, painting me as the embodiment of everything wrong with my generation. Other diners nodded along, some even applauding his words. In the midst of his speech, he made a grand gesture that sent my water glass flying. The contents splashed across the table, directly onto my phone, which I'd foolishly left screen up beside my plate. He immediately apologized, dabbing at the phone with his napkin, but I saw the satisfied gleam in his eyes as the screen flickered and went dark. My lifeline to the outside world, my ability to call for help or document what was happening, gone in an instant of calculated clumsiness. The restaurant security moved closer, clearly assessing whether to intervene. My parents, sensing the shift in atmosphere, switched tactics with breathtaking speed. My mother's voice became soft and wounded as she addressed the security guard, directly explaining that I'd invited them to this expensive restaurant and was now refusing to pay the bill. She pulled out her phone, showing what appeared to be text messages from me begging them to come to dinner, promising to treat them to celebrate my recent promotion. I stared at the fabricated messages in shock. They'd created an entire conversation, complete with enthusiasm and emoji I never used, building a digital paper trail for this moment. The messages were dated days ago, showing planning and forethought that made my stomach turn. My father added his own phone to the evidence, showing similar messages, creating a coordinated lie that would be difficult to dispute without my own phone to prove otherwise. The security guard looked between us, clearly unsure how to proceed. My mother seized the moment, going live on Facebook again, narrating the situation to her audience. She positioned the phone to capture my face, ensuring her followers could see what she called my guilty expression. The comments poured in immediately, a stream of vitriol directed at me, people threatening to share the video to make me famous for all the wrong reasons. Some commenters said they were on their way to the restaurant to support my poor parents. My father, energized by the digital mob support, escalated further. He wondered aloud if I was on drugs, if that explained my erratic behavior, my paranoia about family, my refusal to honor my obligations. The accusation was brilliant in its cruelty, impossible to disprove in the moment, designed to discredit anything I might say in my defense. Janet gasped, dramatically mentioning she'd noticed my pupils seemed dilated, though we both knew it was the dim restaurant lighting. Harold stepped forward, placing himself between me and the nearest exit, his bulk making escape impossible. He pulled out his phone, showing the upline chat, where dozens of people were discussing my investment, welcoming me to the family, excited about my participation. The pressure wasn't just from my parents anymore, but from an entire network of strangers who'd been told I was their new cash cow. The walls felt like they were closing in, the elegant restaurant transformed into a trap. My mother switched tactics again, her voice becoming shrill as she threatened suicide if I didn't sign the papers. She clutched at her chest, claiming heart palpitations, saying the stress of my rejection was killing her. It was a performance she'd perfected over the years, medical emergencies appearing whenever she didn't get her way. But this time she took it further, grabbing a steak knife from the table, holding it dramatically, while other diners gasped and reached for their phones. The manager immediately called for police, the situation escalating beyond what restaurant security could handle. My parents, realizing they'd overplayed their hand, began destroying evidence of their scheme. My father swept the MLM brochures off the table, stepping on them as if by accident. My mother deleted videos from her phone while maintaining the live stream, narrating that I was forcing them to call police on their own daughter. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. The other diners who had been fooled by my parents' act began to murmur among themselves. Some were still recording, capturing my father's attempt to destroy the papers, my mother's theatrical knife wielding, the obvious coordination between my parents and Harold and Janet. The narrative they'd carefully constructed was beginning to crack, but my parents doubled down, becoming more erratic in their desperation. My mother turned the knife toward herself, not enough to cause real harm, but enough to leave a scratch on her arm. She cried out that I was driving her to hurt herself, that this was what I wanted to destroy my own parents. My father immediately photographed the scratch evidence for whatever legal drama they were planning next. The manipulation was so blatant, so cruel, that even some of their supporters in the restaurant began to look uncomfortable. Through all of this, I remained trapped in my chair, my voice stolen by shock and lifelong conditioning. Every attempt to speak was drowned out by their performance, every movement blocked by their physical positioning. I was simultaneously the audience and the villain in their twisted play, unable to change the script they'd written. The police sirens in the distance grew louder, and I wondered if they would be my salvation or just another audience for my parents' manipulation. Harold and Janet, sensing that things were spiraling beyond their MLM pitch, quietly gathered their things. But not before Janet pressed a business card into my hand, whispering that the offer would remain open when I came to my senses. They melted away into the night, leaving my parents to face the consequences of their escalation alone. But my parents didn't seem worried. They had a lifetime of experience talking their way out of trouble. As we waited for the police, my mother continued her performance for the live stream. My father continued to loudly proclaim my failures to anyone who would listen, and I sat in silence, those crescent nail marks on my wrist throbbing in time with my heartbeat. The beautiful restaurant had become a battlefield, and I was losing a war I never wanted to fight. The tide began to turn with the soft but commanding voice of an elderly woman at the table next to ours. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate and dignified, her silver hair styled in an elegant chignon that matched the refinement of her surroundings. Everyone in the restaurant turned to look as she introduced herself as Miriam Blackwood, and when she mentioned she was a retired family court judge, my parents' faces underwent a subtle but noticeable change. Miriam held up her phone, the screen facing my parents, showing that she'd been recording since the appetizers arrived. Her voice was calm, but carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades cutting through lies in courtrooms. She explained that she'd heard them in the bathroom earlier, my mother coaching my father on exactly when to knock over the water glass, discussing how to make the messages look authentic, laughing about how I'd never see it coming. My mother sputtered, trying to maintain her victim narrative, but Miriam continued with the devastating precision of someone presenting evidence. She'd captured my mother creating the fake text messages in real time using an app designed for exactly that purpose. She'd recorded my father practicing his millennial speech in the bathroom mirror, perfecting his righteous indignation. Most damning, she'd caught them on video, scratching my mother's arm themselves, planning how to blame it on me. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted palpably. The diners who'd been supporting my parents began to look uncomfortable, some putting down their phones, others deleting posts they'd just made. My father tried to bluster his way through, claiming Miriam had misunderstood, that she was a confused old woman, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. My mother's live stream comments were turning hostile as viewers realized they'd been duped. Then Miriam delivered another shock that would change everything. The head chef emerged from the kitchen, still in his whites, and embraced Miriam warmly. Antoine Blackwood was her son, and he'd been watching the situation unfold through the security cameras. He apologized to me directly, saying no guest should ever endure what I'd experienced. He confirmed that he had footage of everything, including my parents, scratching themselves, destroying evidence, and coordinating with Harold and Janet. Antoine revealed something that made my blood run cold and then burn with anger. This wasn't my parents' first attempt at this exact scam. They'd pulled similar stunts at 3 other high-end restaurants in the city, always targeting their children or other family members, always using the same combination of public humiliation and fraudulent evidence. 2 establishments had already banned them, and there was an informal network among restaurant managers warning about their behavior. My roommates burst through the restaurant doors like cavalry arriving at the last moment. Keisha led the charge, her paralegal training evident in how she immediately began documenting everything with professional precision. She'd seen my mother's live stream and recognized the manipulation tactics from cases she'd worked on. Rachel, the social worker, took one look at the scene and began speaking in her professional voice about elder abuse, but in reverse about parents who exploit their adult children. Maya, my third roommate and a part-time social media manager, had already begun what she called a counter-narrative. She'd started her own live stream showing the evidence Miriam had collected, explaining the context my parents had deliberately omitted. The digital tide was turning as viewers began sharing Maya's stream, tagging it with warnings about financial abuse and manipulation tactics. My parents' carefully crafted victim story was crumbling in real time. Keisha approached the manager with the confidence of someone who knew the law. She explained that attempting to force someone to pay for a meal they didn't order using threats and physical restraint constituted multiple crimes, including extortion and false imprisonment. She cited specific statutes, mentioned similar cases, and made it clear that the restaurant could face liability if they tried to enforce my parents' fraudulent claim about the bill. My parents, realizing their scheme was falling apart, made a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. They tried to delete everything from their phones, but Antoine informed them that destroying evidence was itself a crime. My mother dropped her phone in her panic, the screen cracking on the marble floor. My father fumbled with his device, but Miriam calmly noted that she'd already sent copies of all recordings to her cloud storage and would happily share them with law enforcement. Other diners began approaching our table, but not to support my parents as they'd hoped. An elderly man said he'd lost his daughter to similar manipulation and wished someone had intervened for her. A young woman mentioned she'd been estranged from her parents for the same reasons and thanked me for inadvertently showing her she wasn't alone. A couple revealed they'd nearly fallen for the essential oil pitch until they saw the ugly truth behind the sales tactics. Rachel pulled me aside, her professional assessment cutting through my emotional fog. She identified at least 15 different manipulation tactics my parents had used in just this one evening, from gaslighting to triangulation to love bombing followed by devaluation. She explained that this wasn't just bad behavior, but a pattern of psychological abuse that had likely shaped my entire life. Her validation felt like oxygen to someone who'd been drowning. The police arrived to a very different scene than my parents had orchestrated. Instead of finding an ungrateful daughter refusing to pay for dinner, they found a room full of witnesses to attempted extortion. Antoine presented the security footage on a tablet showing everything from my parents ordering the most expensive items while I protested to my father deliberately destroying my phone. Miriam offered her recordings as additional evidence, creating an airtight case against my parents' version of events. My father tried one last manipulation, pulling out his businessman persona to speak officer to officer, man to man, but the lead officer, a woman named Detective Martinez, who bore no relation to my therapist, but shared her no-nonsense demeanor, cut through his attempts with practiced ease. She'd seen this scenario before, parents who viewed their children as retirement plans who used emotional manipulation when direct theft became impossible. Detective Martinez turned to me with unexpected kindness. She explained that I wasn't obligated to pay for any meal I didn't order, that the restaurant had clear footage of my parents placing orders without my consent, that their attempts to physically prevent me from leaving constituted false imprisonment. She asked if I wanted to press charges, and for the first time all evening, I felt like I had choices, like I had power in this situation. The police station's fluorescent lights revealed truths that the restaurant's elegant ambiance had hidden. My parents, stripped of their audience and performance space, looked smaller. Somehow their designer clothes wrinkled their carefully crafted personas cracking. Detective Martinez led us to an interview room where the full scope of their crimes would finally come to light. My roommate stayed with me, Keisha taking notes, Rachel offering quiet support, Maya documenting everything for potential legal needs. Detective Martinez pulled up records on her computer, her expression growing more serious with each click. This wasn't my parents' first arrest for similar schemes. They'd been detained 3 times in the past 5 years, always for variations of the same con manipulation of family members in public spaces, attempted extortion, creating false evidence. Each time they talked their way out of serious charges, but the pattern was clear and damning. She showed me reports from my cousins, aunts, even my elderly grandmother, all describing similar ambush tactics. My father demanded a lawyer, but his bravado had evaporated. My mother had stopped crying. her manipulative tears no longer useful without an audience. They sat in separate interview rooms, and through the window, I could see them for what they really were: desperate grifters who'd run out of easy marks. The essential oil scheme was just their latest attempt, but Detective Martinez revealed they'd previously tried timeshares, cryptocurrency, and even a fake charity in my name. The restaurant owner, Antoine's father, arrived at the station with a thick folder. He'd done his own investigation after his son called him. Reaching out to other restaurant owners in the city, the evidence was overwhelming security footage from multiple establishments, signed witness statements, credit card records, showing the same pattern again and again. My parents would target a family member, create a public scene, and either extract money through guilt or use the confrontation for their next manipulation. Antoine had discovered something even more disturbing in the footage. My parents had arrived at the restaurant an hour before our meeting, casing the location, discussing camera angles, even doing a practice run of their performance. They'd specifically requested a table where other diners could see and hear everything. The waiter confirmed they had asked him to place the bill directly in front of me, claiming it was a surprise celebration where I was treating them. Back at the station, my phone had dried out enough to power on, and the messages were overwhelming. But between the angry relatives my parents had poisoned against me were unexpected allies. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years were sharing their own stories of manipulation. My Aunt Claire sent a long message apologizing for believing my parents' lies, admitting she'd fallen for the same tactics when they'd targeted her daughter last year. The family group chat had split into factions, truth finally breaking through years of carefully maintained facades. My grandmother called Keisha's phone, her voice shaky but determined. She revealed that my parents had been stealing from her for decades, small amounts at first, then larger sums when they thought she wouldn't notice. She'd been too ashamed to tell anyone, too afraid of being seen as a burden. But seeing me stand up to them, seeing the truth finally exposed, gave her courage. She'd already contacted her lawyer about pressing charges for elder abuse and theft. The detective revealed that the MLM company my parents were promoting was already under federal investigation. Harold and Janet, their supposed mentors, were persons of interest in a multi-state fraud case. By attempting to recruit me, my parents had accidentally provided evidence for a much larger investigation. The FBI would be taking over parts of the case, particularly the interstate fraud elements. My parents' dreams of easy money had led them directly into federal charges. As the night wore on, more truth emerged. The designer clothes were knockoffs purchased with credit cards in other people's names. The Rolex was fake, though they'd convinced several pawn shops otherwise. Their supposed wealth was all performance funded by a rotating cast of victims. The house they claimed to own was in foreclosure. The car they'd driven to the restaurant was a rental they couldn't afford. Their entire life was a house of cards, and tonight it had finally collapsed. Detective Martinez explained my options moving forward. I could press charges for attempted extortion, false imprisonment, and destruction of property. The restaurant could pursue fraud charges for the attempted dine and dash disguised as family drama. With the evidence from multiple incidents, my parents were facing serious jail time. For the first time in my life, they would face real consequences for their actions. My mother tried one last manipulation when she was allowed to speak to me. She promised to get help, to go to therapy, to change. It was a script I'd heard before whenever consequences loomed. But this time I had witnesses to her patterns, professionals who recognized the manipulation. Dr. Martinez had been right. They wouldn't change because they didn't want to. They saw nothing wrong with viewing their child as an ATM machine. The prosecutor assigned to the case was thorough and unsympathetic to my parents' sob stories. She'd seen too many cases of familial financial abuse, too many adult children bankrupted by parents who felt entitled to their success. She assured me that with the mountain of evidence, including their prior attempts and the federal investigation connection, my parents would likely take a plea deal rather than risk trial. By dawn, my parents had been formally charged and released on bail with strict conditions. They were prohibited from contacting me, my roommates, or any of the witnesses. They couldn't enter any upscale restaurants in the city. Their social media accounts would be monitored, and any attempts to harass or defame me would result in immediate jail time. For the first time in 28 years, I was legally protected from the people who were supposed to protect me. The restaurant bill was voided, the owner refusing to hold me responsible for my parents' fraud. Antoine personally apologized for not intervening sooner, explaining that his staff was trained to avoid interfering in what appeared to be family matters. He offered me a standing reservation at the restaurant, a chance to create new memories in a place that had seen my worst nightmare. It was a kind gesture, though I couldn't imagine eating there again without remembering this night. As we left the police station, the sun was rising over the city. My roommates flanked me like bodyguards, exhausted, but victorious. We'd entered that restaurant as four young women sharing an apartment. But we left as something more. They'd seen me at my most vulnerable and stood by me. They'd fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. If family was supposed to be the people who showed up for you, then I'd found my real family. 3 months later, I sat in Dr. Martinez's office, the familiar space, feeling different now that I had different stories to tell. The restraining order against my parents was firmly in place, a legal document that validated what I'd always known, but couldn't articulate. I had the right to protect myself from people who claimed to love me while actively trying to destroy me. The panic attacks had subsided, replaced by a cautious peace I was still learning to trust. My journey toward healing hadn't been linear. The first weeks after the restaurant incident were brutal, filled with guilt and second-guessing. Had I overreacted? Could I have handled it differently? Should I have just paid the bill to keep the peace? Dr. Martinez patiently worked through each doubt, reminding me that questioning my own reality was a symptom of the gaslighting I'd endured. She helped me understand that my parents had installed these buttons in my psyche, and they knew exactly how to push them. The legal proceedings moved forward with surprising speed. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the connection to the federal MLM investigation, my parents had accepted a plea deal. 2 years probation, mandatory counseling, and most importantly, financial restitution, not just to me, but to all their victims. The judge reviewing the case history had been particularly unsympathetic to their tears. She'd seen too many parents who viewed their children as retirement plans rather than human beings deserving of respect and autonomy. I'd started a support group for survivors of financial abuse by family members. What began as 3 people meeting in a coffee shop had grown to 20 regular members with an online community of hundreds. We shared resources, legal advice, and most importantly, validation. There was something powerful about saying my parents stole from me and having people respond with mine too instead of the usual, but they're your parents' rhetoric that society usually offered. The ripple effects of that night continued to spread through our extended family. My grandmother, emboldened by my stand, had pressed charges against my parents for the money they'd stolen from her over the years. Several cousins came forward with their own stories. Aunt Claire became an unexpected ally, sharing documentation she'd kept of my parents' schemes going back decades. The family narrative carefully controlled by my parents for so long had shattered and reformed around truth instead of manipulation. My parents were required to attend therapy as part of their plea agreement, though I held no hope for genuine change. The therapist assigned to them sent periodic reports to the court, and from what I was legally allowed to know, they spent most sessions trying to convince her that they were the real victims. Old habits died hard, and narcissistic patterns died harder. But their inability to change was no longer my problem or my responsibility. At work, my productivity soared without the constant drain of their manufactured crises. My boss noticed the change, and when I finally felt safe enough to share an abbreviated version of my story, she revealed her own experiences with toxic family members. She became a mentor in more than just marketing, teaching me how to set professional boundaries that protected my peace. The raise I received went straight into savings, a security blanket my parents could never touch. My relationship with money underwent a complete transformation. Working with a financial advisor who specialized in financial abuse recovery, I learned to see money not as something to be hidden or hoarded in fear, but as a tool for building the life I wanted. Every dollar saved was a vote for my freedom, every investment a step away from the chaos my parents had tried to trap me in. The savings account that had once seemed impossible now held a solid emergency fund. The support group revealed patterns I hadn't recognized in my own story. We all shared similar experiences, parents who felt entitled to our success, who used emotional manipulation when direct theft became impossible, who painted themselves as victims while victimizing us. Together, we developed strategies for protecting ourselves both legally and emotionally. We created resource guides, recommended lawyers and therapists, and most importantly, reminded each other that we deserve better. One unexpected joy came from reconnecting with family members I'd been isolated from. My parents had spent years painting me as difficult, selfish, ungrateful, creating rifts they could exploit. But with the truth exposed, I discovered cousins who'd always wondered about my side of the story, aunts who'd suspected something was wrong, but didn't know how to help. Not all relationships could be salvaged, but the ones that were became stronger for having survived the deception. I also learned to recognize the red flags I'd been trained to ignore. Love bombing, followed by devaluation, triangulation using other family members, gaslighting about events I clearly remembered, financial boundaries being treated as betrayal. These patterns, once invisible to me, now stood out in stark relief. I could spot them in other relationships too: work, dynamics, friendships, romantic partners. The education my parents had unwillingly given me became a shield against future manipulation. The volunteer work I did with financial abuse prevention became a cornerstone of my healing. Speaking to groups about recognizing the signs, understanding the patterns, protecting themselves legally and financially. Every person I helped avoid what I'd experienced felt like reclaiming power my parents had stolen. I partnered with Miriam, who'd become a grandmother figure to me, to create workshops for judges and lawyers about recognizing familial financial abuse. My living situation evolved too. While I kept my roommates, we moved to a better apartment, one where my parents didn't know the address. The space was more than just shelter. It was a symbol of independence earned through hard battles. We hosted dinners for our chosen family people who'd proven their love through actions rather than demanding it through manipulation. These gatherings, filled with genuine laughter and mutual respect, showed me what family was supposed to feel like. The restaurant Le Bernardin became an unexpected place of healing. Antoine invited our support group to use their private dining room for meetings. Where my parents had tried to destroy me, I now helped rebuild others. The elegant space that had witnessed my humiliation became a place of empowerment. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of the table where it all happened, and instead of pain, I felt pride. I'd survived. I'd won. I'd broken free. Recently, a number I didn't recognize called during one of our support group dinners. I let it go to voicemail, as I always did with unknown numbers now. Later, listening to the message, I heard my mother's voice, tearful and pleading, using a friend's phone to circumvent the no-contact order. She needed money, just a small loan she promised to pay back. The old guilt tried to surface, but I deleted the message without hesitation. Some bridges weren't meant to be rebuilt. They were meant to stay burned, their ashes, a reminder of hard-won freedom. As I looked around the table at my chosen family, at people who loved me without price tags attached, I thought about the lessons this journey had taught me. Family isn't an obligation to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. Love doesn't come with invoices. Blood relation doesn't entitle anyone to destroy your peace or drain your accounts. Sometimes the greatest act of love for yourself, and even for them, is walking away and staying gone. The girl who'd sat frozen in that restaurant, unable to voice her own defense, was gone. In her place stood a woman who understood her worth wasn't measured in dollars given to unworthy people. I'd learned that boundaries weren't walls keeping love out, but fences protecting the garden of peace I'd cultivated. And if that meant some people had to stay on the other side of those fences, admiring from a distance the life they could have been part of, if they'd chosen love over greed, then so be it. What would you do if your parents ambushed you with a massive restaurant bill? Have you experienced financial manipulation from family members? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content about surviving family dysfunction and building healthy boundaries. Share this with anyone who needs to hear that it's okay to protect yourself from toxic family members. Thank you for being part of this journey with me, and remember, you deserve relationships that nurture you, not drain you. Until next time, stay strong and keep choosing yourself.